They say the first sign of a building's collapse isn't the roof caving in or the walls buckling. It's a sound. A tiny, crystalline snap deep within the foundation, something so quiet that if you aren't listening for it, you'll miss it entirely. I've spent 36 years listening for those snaps. As a licensed architect in Charleston, South Carolina, my job was to ensure that things stayed upright. I designed the pediatric wing at MUSC, the waterfront hotels that catch the Atlantic breeze, and the office blocks on East Bay. I know how much weight a beam can carry before it screams. I know that old money in this city smells like salt water and secrets, and I know that the most dangerous cracks are the ones you can't see from the street. The snap happened at Bourne, Muy PM on Thanksgiving Day. I was 68 years old, sitting at the head of a table I had polished myself, in a house I had built with my own hands. The duck was resting citrus brine for 24 hours, a recipe I'd spent 2 decades perfecting. My mother's silver from Beaufort was laid out on pressed white linen. Everything looked perfect. Structurally, the room seemed sound. But then Stephanie leaned over, her voice a stage whisper that cut through the clinking of wine glasses like a serrated blade. "He's worthless, Nathan," she said. "He's just taking up space and burning through the Capitol. It's time. Cut him off completely." The room went into a vacuum. I looked at my son, Nathan, my only child, the boy who used to sit on my drafting stool and ask why some walls were thicker than others. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to tell his wife that she was talking about the man who had paid for his Duke tuition, his law degree, and the very roof over his head. Instead, Nathan took a slow, deliberate sip of his Cabernet, set the glass down, and gave a small, weary nod. In that moment, the foundation didn't just crack. It vanished. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I simply folded my napkin white linen, monogrammed WAR for Walter Reed into a perfect rectangle. I stood up, thanked them for their company, and walked out onto the back porch into the Nummoy Mote degree harbor air. I didn't even take a jacket. The cold was a relief compared to the heat of the betrayal radiating from the dining room. By Friday morning, I was at the bank on Calhoun Street before the doors even opened. By Friday afternoon, $2 million had been moved into a revocable trust they couldn't touch, and by Sunday evening, I had Matrum High missed calls on my phone. They thought they were the ones doing the cutting. They didn't realize that when you remove a load-bearing wall without a plan, the whole house comes down on your head. To understand how we got to that table, you have to understand the house at Mtngin Tarm Trum Bournemouth Byre Palmetto Bluff Drive. I designed the addition myself 3 years ago, a sprawling, light-filled space meant for a family to grow into. When Nathan and Stephanie told me they were struggling to get on their feet after his firm hit a slow patch, I did what any father would do. I opened the door. "Just for a few months," Nathan had said, "until the Broad Street deal closes." 3 years later, they were still there, and slowly the house was no longer mine. It started with the organized chaos sign in the garage. Stephanie, who runs an interior design blog with Bournemouth Byre followers, decided my lumber stacks were eyesores. She pushed my mahogany and cypress into a damp corner to make room for her white SUV. She called the living room the common gallery. She began referring to my presence as living with a very opinionated museum. I watched my son shrink. It was like watching a building settle into soft mud. Every month he seemed a little less like the man I raised and more like an accessory to Stephanie's curated lifestyle. He stopped asking about the load-bearing walls. He started asking about my long-term care preferences. The weekend before Thanksgiving, I found something that should have been my first real warning. I was in the garage looking for a specific rasp for the boat I'm restoring, a Mtngin Cheen Trum Nummoy High wooden catch called the Claire. Hidden behind a stack of Stephanie's aesthetic storage bins, I found a manila folder. Inside weren't design sketches. They were printouts of my own investment accounts. There were highlighted sections regarding succession in cases of cognitive decline. There was a business card for a lawyer on Broad Street I'd never heard of. And most chillingly, there was a printed Zillow estimate for my house, with a handwritten note in the margin. "Market is peaking. We need to move by Qmote." I remember standing there, the smell of sawdust and salt in the air, feeling a sudden, sharp vertigo. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively drafting the blueprints for my eviction. That night, I didn't sleep. I went down to the marina and sat on the Claire. The boat was a wreck when I found her rotten ribs, peeling varnish, a heart that had lost its rhythm. But the thing about a wooden boat is that it doesn't lie to you. If there's rot, you find it, you scrape it out, you replace it with something stronger. I sat in the dark cabin and thought about the co-signer agreement. 3 years ago, after a minor heart procedure, I'd added Nathan to one of my primary investment accounts. It was a just-in-case measure, a gesture of trust. At the time, I thought I was giving him a safety net. Now, looking at the memory of that highlighted folder, I realized I'd handed him a sledgehammer. At the Thanksgiving dinner, Stephanie's worthless comment wasn't an outburst. It was a test. It was a signal to Nathan that the renovation of their lives, the one that required my total removal, was ready to begin. They thought I was an old man who was too tired to fight back. They thought I was part of the museum, a relic to be sold off to the highest bidder. But they forgot one thing about architects. We don't just build. We know exactly how to dismantle a structure so that it falls precisely where we want it to. Friday morning after I left the bank, I didn't go home. I went to see Marshall Cade. Marshall has been my attorney for 11 years. He's a man who communicates primarily through the arrangement of his silences and the sharpness of his suits. "Walter," he said, looking at the documents I'd brought him, the ones I'd quietly pulled from my fire-rated cabinet at BA Kong AM. "You realize that if you move these funds now, Nathan will receive a notification as a co-signer within 48 hours. "I'm counting on it, Marshall," I said. "I want him to see the numbers move. I want him to feel the floorboards shifting. And the will? Rewrite it, every bit of it. The house, the Harbor Point partnership, the liquid assets, everything goes into the trust for Cody. Cody is my 4-year-old grandson. He's the only thing in that house that isn't calculated. He still smells like baby shampoo and crackers. And he still looks at me like I'm a giant who knows how the world works." "And Nathan?" Marshall asked, his pen hovering over the paper. "Nathan gets exactly what he agreed I was worth at dinner," I said. "Nothing. I spent Saturday at the marina, working on the Claire's starboard bow. I was fitting new planking, a job that requires agonizing patience. You have to steam the wood, bend it slowly, and wait for it to take the shape of the hull. If you rush it, the wood snaps. If you go too slow, it loses its pliability. It's all about the tension." My phone started vibrating around Mui. Kong AM. Nathan. Cell. Nathan. Cell. Stephanie. Cell. Nathan. Cell. I didn't answer. I just kept working the epoxy, smoothing the seams, watching the sun reflect off the Cooper River. I could imagine the scene at the house. Nathan checking his banking app, the blood draining from his face as he saw the high Hong dollar transfer. Stephanie pacing the common gallery, her mind already calculating the loss of her curated future. When I finally drove back to Palmetto Bluff Drive on Sunday evening, the air was thick, the driveway was crowded. There was a car I didn't recognize, a sleek black sedan parked right in the center, blocking my spot. I parked on the street and walked up the path I'd laid myself. Through the large front windows I could see them. Nathan was standing by the fireplace, looking small. Stephanie was talking to a man in a gray suit, the lawyer from the business card I'd found in the garage. I opened the front door. The chime, which I'd chosen for its soft, welcoming tone, sounded like a funeral bell. The room went silent. Stephanie turned, her face a mask of practiced concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Walter," she said, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We've been so worried. We saw some unusual activity on the accounts. We thought maybe you'd been targeted by a scam, or that you weren't feeling yourself." She glanced at the man in the gray suit. "This is Mr. Henderson," she continued. "He's a specialist. He's here to help us make sure your assets are protected, given your recent behavior." I looked at my son. "Nathan?" Nathan wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the monogrammed rug. "Dad, we just think, maybe the stress of the boat and the house. Maybe you aren't thinking clearly. The transfer you made? It's not legal. As a co-signer, I have a claim to those funds. Henderson says we can file an injunction by Monday morning." I felt a cold, familiar sensation. It was the feeling of a building reaching its stress limit. "The funds are already in the trust, Nathan," I said quietly. "And as for your claim, I think you should read the fine print of the agreement you signed 3 years ago. I didn't make you an owner. I made you a deputy. And deputies can be dismissed." Stephanie stepped forward, her eyes flashing. The mask was slipping now. "We aren't going anywhere, Walter. This is our home. We have a life here. You can't just flip a switch and decide we don't exist because of a misunderstanding at dinner." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Stephanie," I said. "It was a structural assessment, and I found the foundation wanting." I turned to the lawyer, Henderson. You might want to check the county records before you file that injunction, Mr. Henderson. I think you'll find that McGinn Tarm Trom Bornwe Buyer Palmetto Bluff Drive is no longer titled in my name. The silence that followed was different than the one at Thanksgiving. This one was heavy. This one had the weight of a roof about to give way. What did you do? Nathan whispered, finally looking up. I did what any good architect does when he finds rot, I said. I started the demolition. But as I looked at the folder Henderson was holding, I realized I'd missed something. A piece of paper was sticking out, a document with a logo I recognized all too well. It was from the city planning office. My heart hammered against my ribs. They hadn't just been planning to sell the house. They had been planning to tear it down. The document Henderson held wasn't just a legal brief. It bore the blue and gold seal of the Charleston Board of Architectural Review. In this city, that seal is holy. It's the gatekeeper of history, the final word on what stays and what goes. As I stared at the bold letters at the top, application for demolition, the air in the room seemed to thin until I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears. I built this house in Mutngin Chin Trum Chinwe born. I didn't just hire a crew and sign checks. I lived in a trailer on the lot for 8 months. I knew the curing time of the concrete in the slab. I knew the grain of the heart pine floors because I'd hand-selected the reclaimed timber from an old mill in the upstate. Every window was positioned to catch the specific amber quality of the low-country sunset, but most importantly, I had built it for Claire. My wife, Nathan's mother. She had passed away 12 years ago, but her fingerprints were everywhere in the height of the kitchen counters, the specific shade of sea salt blue in the breakfast nook, and the way the porch wrapped around the house to face the salt marshes she loved. To Nathan and Stephanie, it was just a high-value lot in a gated community. To them, the house was an obstacle, an old, opinionated museum standing in the way of a modern glass and steel monstrosity that would look better on an Instagram feed. You were going to tear it down, I said. My voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a falling beam. Stephanie didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She crossed her arms, her designer bracelets clinking with a sound like shattering glass. Walter, let's be realistic. The layout is dated. The maintenance costs on a custom wood build like this are astronomical. We've already talked to a developer. A multi-unit modern build on this lot would triple the property value. It's about your legacy. It's about ensuring Nathan and Cody are set for life. 3035 Dower, my legacy is standing around you, I said, my voice gaining a hard, sharp edge, and you want to turn it into dust. I looked at Nathan. He looked like a man who had been caught in a lie and was trying to convince himself it was actually a favor. Dad, the market is shifting. We're just trying to be proactive. Henderson says that with the right presentation, we can argue the structure has irremediable deferred maintenance. We can get the permit. Irremediable deferred maintenance. Those were the words they were going to use to kill my house. I thought about the hours I'd spent on the Claire, painstakingly restoring barmo-year-old wood, while my own son was plotting to bulldoze the very foundation of his childhood. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the first layer of the rot I was about to uncover. That night, after I'd retreated to the boat, I couldn't stop thinking about the way things used to be. Architecture is the art of memory made tangible. I remembered Nathan at 7 years old, wearing a plastic hard hat, helping me level the first course of bricks. I remembered Claire bringing us lemonade and laughing because Nathan had more mortar on his face than on the bricks. Back then, the structure of our family felt indestructible. We were tied together by shared history and mutual respect, the kind of invisible supports you only notice when they're gone. When Claire died, the house became my sanctuary. Nathan was in college then, and for a while, we stayed close. But then came the slow patch at his firm. Then came Stephanie. Then came the slow patch. She was a force of nature, curated, polished, and relentlessly ambitious. She saw the world through a lens of potential, which is just a polite word for profit. She didn't see a home, she saw a portfolio. I'd watched her systematically strip the warmth out of the house over 3 years. The family photos were replaced by abstract prints. The cozy rugs were swapped for hard, minimalist stone. She was preparing the site for a long time before I ever saw the paperwork. But a house is more than its walls. It's the legal framework that holds it to the earth. Monday morning, I met Marshall Cade at a small diner far from the legal district. I didn't want to be seen. I showed him the photo I'd snapped of the demolition application. Marshall looked at it through his reading glasses, his mouth a thin, grim line. "They're moving fast, Walter," he said. The Bar Board of Architectural Review meeting is scheduled for next month. If they can prove the house is a financial liability and that you aren't competent to manage its upkeep, they might just get that permit. Over my dead body, I said. They're counting on that too, Marshall replied, but there's a flaw in their plan, a structural one. He leaned in, the smell of black coffee and old leather surrounding us. To get a demolition permit in this district, every titled owner must sign the application. They were banking on the co-signer agreement giving Nathan the authority to sign on your behalf. But because you moved the property into the Qualified Personal Residence Trust QPRT on Friday, that authority is gone. As of Chin Hung AM this morning, the owner of record is the W.D. Reed Family Trust, and you are the sole trustee. I felt a small, cold spark of satisfaction. So the application is void. Technically, yes. But they don't know that yet. And here's the interesting part. I did some digging into Henderson's firm. He's not just their lawyer, Walter. He's a silent partner in the development group that was slated to buy the lot once the house was gone. I sat back, the weight of the betrayal hitting me all over again. It wasn't just my son being manipulated, it was a coordinated strike. My house, my history, my very sanity, it was all just a line item in a business deal. What's the next move? I asked. More. In architecture, you sometimes use a shoring technique to stabilize a building while you replace the foundation. We're going to shore up your life, Walter. And then we're going to let their plan collapse under its own weight. The tension in the house over the next week was a physical thing. It was in the way the floorboards creaked when Stephanie walked past my study. It was in the heavy silence that descended every time I entered the kitchen. I was a ghost in my own home. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for an outburst, something they could record and use as evidence of undue emotional distress or diminished capacity. I knew the game now. Every time Stephanie made a passive-aggressive comment about the smell of the docks clinging to my clothes, I just smiled and thanked her for her concern. I was being the most reasonable man in Charleston. It was infuriating them. On Wednesday, I was in the garage, ostensibly looking for a wrench, when I heard Nathan and Stephanie arguing in the laundry room. The door was cracked, and their voices carried through the vents a design flaw I'd never bothered to fix, and one I was suddenly very grateful for. Henderson needs the signature by Friday, Nathan, Stephanie hissed. The developers are getting twitchy. If we don't have the permit in hand by the QMOT meeting, the funding for the Mount Pleasant project disappears. He won't sign. Nathan's voice was ragged, filled with a desperate kind of exhaustion. You saw him. He moved the money. He's onto us, Steph. He's an old man who's losing his grip, she snapped. We have the medical notes from his cardiologist. We have the confusion incidents I've been documenting for the blog. If he won't sign, we go to court for a temporary guardianship. We only need it for 72 hours. Long enough to push the paperwork through. I stood frozen in the dark garage, my hand gripping a cold steel rack. Confusion incidents. She had been fabricating a trail of breadcrumbs for months, likely using my grief over Claire or my focus on the boat as evidence that I was slipping. I realized then that this wasn't just about the house or the high $1 million, it was about Nathan's own survival. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore, he was a man drowning in debt, tethered to a woman whose ambition had no bottom. But then, I heard something that made the hair on my neck stand up. What about the other account? Nathan asked. The one in Beaufort? It's empty, Stephanie said, her voice dropping to a low, cold vibration. I moved that 6 months ago. He'll never find it. By the time he realizes the Claire Memorial Fund is gone, we'll be halfway through the new build. The Claire Memorial Fund. It was a small endowment I'd set up to provide scholarships for young architects from low-income backgrounds. It wasn't millions, but it was sacred. It was her name. I felt the last of my hesitation vanish. Until that moment, I'd been playing defense. I'd been trying to protect myself. Now, I was going to be the one who picked up the sledgehammer. I didn't know it yet, but the other account wasn't the only secret Stephanie was keeping. And what I was about to find in her office would change the entire architecture of my revenge. I walked out of the garage and straight to my car. I had 48 hours before their Friday deadline. I needed to see Diana Foster again, and this time, I wasn't just looking for financial records. I was looking for the snap. The one thing that, if pulled, would bring their entire world screaming down. I drove toward the marina, the city of Charleston blurred in my peripheral vision. I thought about the Claire. I thought about the way you have to strip back the old paint to see the true condition of the wood. Stephanie thought she was a designer. She thought she knew how to style a life. But she didn't understand the first rule of building. If you build on a foundation of lies, the house always falls. I reached for my phone and dialed Diana. "I need everything you can find on a Mount Pleasant project involving Henderson and Stephanie Reed," I said. "And Diana, look into the tax filings for the Claire Memorial Fund." I think someone just handed us the explosives. As I pulled into the marina, I saw a familiar car parked near Slip 7. It was Nathan's SUV. He was sitting on the dock, staring at the Claire, his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had realized the load-bearing wall he was leaning on was made of paper. I stepped out of the car, the salt air filling my lungs. This was the moment. The structure was failing. I just had to decide whether to catch him or let him fall with the rest of it. But then, Nathan looked up, and the expression on his face wasn't one of regret. It was something else. Something that told me the betrayal went much deeper than a house or a bank account. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling, "there's something you don't know about the night Mom died." The world stopped. The harbor, the boat, the salt, it all went gray. "What did you say?" I asked. "I didn't want to tell you," he whispered. "But Stephanie, she's going to use it. If you don't sign the papers, she's going to tell everyone what really happened at the hospital." The snap was so loud I thought the whole dock had given way. The water in the harbor was the color of lead, heavy and unmoving. Nathan's words hung in the air between us like a suspended load on a frayed cable. I looked at my son, the man I had taught to appreciate the integrity of a well-poured slab, and I realized he was standing on a foundation of pure sand. "The hospital, Nathan?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the salt wind. "What could she possibly say about the night your mother died?" Nathan didn't look up. He was picking at a splinter on the dock's weathered wood. "She has a recording, Dad, from that old digital recorder you used to keep in the study for your project notes. You left it in the room that night. The night the doctor told us the second round of chemo hadn't worked. I felt a coldness settle into my bones that had nothing to do with the Charleston winter. I remembered that night. It was the darkest structure I'd ever had to navigate. Claire had been in so much pain that her breath sounded like dry leaves scraping on pavement. I had sent Nathan to the cafeteria to get a coffee he didn't want, just to give him a moment of air. And then I had talked to the doctor. "She says the recording proves you pressured the medical team to increase the morphine," Nathan whispered. "She says you told them she was too expensive to keep fighting and that you were ready to be finished with it. She's already edited the clip, Dad. It sounds terrible." I closed my eyes. In architecture, a forced failure is when you purposely stress a material to see where it breaks. Stephanie wasn't just stressing me. She was trying to pulverize my very soul. The truth was that I had begged the doctor to manage her pain, to let her go with dignity instead of drowning in her own lungs. I had never mentioned the cost. We had the money. I would have spent every cent I owned to give Claire one more hour of comfort. But Stephanie, the curated storyteller, knew that the truth is often less powerful than a well-edited lie. In the court of public opinion, and especially in the Board of Architectural Review, a whisper of mercy killing or financial negligence would be enough to strip me of my reputation and my home. "And you believe her, Nathan?" I asked. "You were there. You saw how much I loved her." Nathan finally looked at me, and I saw the hollowed-out shell of the boy he used to be. "It doesn't matter what I believe, Dad. She's going to release it to the local news and the bar if you don't sign the demolition permit and the guardianship papers by Friday. She told me she's already drafted the blog post. The dark side of a Charleston icon. She's going to destroy you." I looked at my son and realized he wasn't there to warn me out of love. He was there because he was the messenger for a terrorist. "Go home." "Nathan," I said, my voice as steady as a plumb line. "Dad, please, just sign the papers. We can build the new house. You can have the penthouse suite. It'll be modern, easy to maintain." "Go home," I repeated. I watched him walk away, his shoulders hunched against the wind. I didn't tell him that I'd already moved the house into a trust. I didn't tell him about the $1 million. I wanted him to live in the silence of his own choices for a little while longer. I needed to see how far he would let her go. The next morning, I was at Diana Foster's office before the sun had fully cleared the steeples of the holy city. Diana looked at the photo of the demolition application I'd sent her, then back at me. Her stillness was the only thing keeping me from vibrating apart. "I need you to dig deeper into Stephanie," I said. "Not just the LLC. I want to know where she came from before she met Nathan. People don't just become this proficient at destruction overnight. This is professional-grade demolition." Diana tapped her pen. I've already started. Her Columbia background? It's half true. She was born there, but she grew up in Miami. Her father was a high-end real estate facilitator who spent 4 years in federal prison for racketeering. Stephanie changed her last name 10 years ago after a series of unfortunate estate disputes in South Florida involving older, wealthy men. I sat back, the vertigo returning. A series. 3, Diana said. All of them ended in private settlements. She's a professional beneficiary, Walter. She finds a structure with a weak point, usually a grieving man or a struggling son, and she moves in until the whole thing is hers. What about the Mount Pleasant project? I asked. That's where it gets interesting. Henderson, the lawyer, isn't just a partner in the development. He's also the primary investor in Stephanie's design blog. It's a front for a kickback scheme. They identify properties owned by seniors, use the blog to consult on renovations that actually devalue the historic status, and then swoop in with demolition permits once the owners are declared incompetent. It was a perfect predatory ecosystem, and I was the current mark. She's blackmailing me with a recording from the night Claire died, I said, my voice cracking for the first time. I told her about the morphine, the doctor, and the edited tape. Diana didn't look shocked. She looked like a hunter who had just found a fresh trail. Walter, an edited recording is a federal crime if used for extortion, but we need the original. Do you still have that recorder? It's in the house, I said. In my study. Or at least, it was. If she's smart, she destroyed the original and kept the digital edit, Diana said. But people like Stephanie are often victims of their own vanity. She'll have the raw file somewhere as insurance against Henderson. We need that file. I'm going back in, I said. Walking back into Mutngin Tamtram Bournemouth Bar Palmetto Bluff Drive felt like entering a building that had been condemned but hadn't realized it yet. The air felt stale, despite the expensive candles Stephanie had burning in every room. She was in the kitchen, perfectly coiffed, filming a segment for her Instagram. And that's how you style a Thanksgiving leftover charcuterie board for a curated Friday lunch, she said to her phone, which was perched on a tripod. She saw me and didn't stop. She finished her take, flashed a blinding, artificial smile at the camera, and then turned to me. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory squint. Nathan talked to you, she said. It wasn't a question. He did. Then you know the deadline. Henderson is coming by at p.m. on Friday with the notary. You'll sign the demolition application and the voluntary transfer of guardianship. If you do, the recording stays in my private archive. If you don't, I hit publish at moat. I walked to the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of water. My hand didn't shake. You know, Stephanie, I've spent my life studying the way things fall. Most people think it's the big storm that does it. But usually it's just one small neglected leak, a bit of moisture in the wrong place, a bit of rot in the heart of the wood. She laughed a sharp, brittle sound. Save the metaphors for your boat, Walter. I'm not a building, I'm the storm. Is that what you told the men in Miami? I asked. The silence that followed was so thick I could almost taste the dust in it. Stephanie's face didn't change, but her eyes went very, very still. It was the look of a predator realizing the prey just bit back. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. Diana Foster is a very thorough woman, I said. She's found the unfortunate estate disputes. She's found your father's racketeering records, and she's currently looking into the tax filings for the Claire Memorial Fund. I saw the snap. It was a tiny twitch in her jaw, the first visible crack in her curated exterior. You have nothing, she hissed. That fund was mismanaged long before I got here. Nathan will testify to that. He's on my side, Walter. He's always been on my side. He's on the side of whoever is holding the leash, I said. But even a dog will bite if you starve him long enough, and I think Nathan is starting to realize how hungry he's gotten. I turned and walked toward my study, leaving her standing in her curated kitchen. I knew I was playing a dangerous game. I didn't have the recording. I didn't have the proof of the kickbacks yet. I was shoring up a crumbling wall with nothing but bluff and bravado. I entered my study and locked the door. I began searching for the old digital recorder, but I knew it was gone. Stephanie wasn't careless. But then, I looked at the floorboards. In Mutngin Chintram Chin Mui Born, when I was building the study, I had installed a small, secret compartment beneath the built-in bookshelves. It wasn't for gold or jewels. It was for the original blueprints of the house. I hadn't opened it in a decade. I knelt down, my knees protesting the movement. and used a thin letter opener to pop the tension-latched board. The blueprints were there, smelling of old paper and blue ink, but sitting on top of them was something else. A small silver thumb drive with a sticky note attached in Claire's neat, elegant handwriting. "For Walter, just in case you forget how we started." My heart stopped. Claire had a habit of backing up my project notes. She'd always been the one to keep me organized, the one who made sure the museum didn't fall into chaos. I plugged the drive into my laptop with trembling fingers. There were hundreds of files, audio notes on the Moose Wing, sketches for the waterfront hotel, and a folder labeled Hospital, Final Days. I clicked it. The first file was dated the night of the morphine discussion. I hit play. The sound of the hospital monitor was the first thing I heard, that steady, rhythmic beep that haunts my dreams. Then, my own voice, sounding 20 years older than it was. "I can't watch her like this, doctor. Please, whatever the cost, whatever we have to do, just make sure she isn't afraid. Make sure she isn't in pain. I'll pay for the extra palliative staff. I'll pay for the private nurses. Just don't let her go out in the dark." And then, the doctor's voice. "We'll do our best, Mr. Reed. But the cost for the specialized care isn't covered by—" "I don't care about the money," I had shouted. "The money is paper. She is my life. Use the memorial fund if you have to. Just get the specialists here from Atlanta." It was all there, the raw, unedited truth. I hadn't been trying to kill her. I had been trying to buy her one more breath of peace, but there was more. The recording kept running after I left the room. I heard the door creak open. I heard a voice I recognized, younger, but unmistakably hers. "Is he gone?" Stephanie's voice asked. "Yes," Nathan replied. He sounded like he was crying. "Good. Did you see where he put the password list for the memorial fund? We need to move the first installment before the hospital registers the specialist request. If we wait, the money will be locked in probate." "Steph, we can't. My mom is right there." "Your mom is already gone, Nathan, but our future isn't. Now find the paper." I sat in the dark study, the blue light of the laptop screen reflecting off my tears. They hadn't just been waiting for her to die. They had started picking her pockets while she was still breathing. The worthless comment at Thanksgiving wasn't the beginning. It was the victory lap. I looked at the clock. It was born. Home PM on Thursday. I had 25 hours until Henderson arrived with the notary. I reached for my phone and called Marshall Cade. "Marshall," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble in the MUSC lobby. "I have the blueprints, all of them, and I'm ready to start the demolition. What do you need me to do?" Marshall asked. "Call the Board of Architectural Review," I said, "and call the Charleston Police Department. I have a report to file about a series of unfortunate estate disputes." I didn't know it yet, but the biggest twist wasn't in the recording. It was in the Mount Pleasant project itself. Because when I looked closer at the blueprints Stephanie had been so eager to hide, I realized they weren't building a modern multi-unit. They were building something much, much darker, and they were using my name to do it. Friday morning arrived, with a sky the color of a bruised plum. In Charleston, the air before a storm has a specific density. It's thick with the scent of ozone and the salt of the Atlantic, making every breath feel like a deliberate act. I sat in my study, the door locked, watching the digital clock on my desk. 8 hours. That was all that remained before Henderson arrived with the notary and the end of my life as I knew it. I had spent the preceding 6 hours from midnight until dawn dissecting the files on that silver thumb drive. My mother used to say that if you look at anything long enough, it will eventually tell you its secrets. The files were a masterclass in professional-grade betrayal. There was the Mount Pleasant project folder, which I had initially assumed was just a generic development. But as I opened the CAD files and the structural spreadsheets, the true shape of the rot began to emerge. It wasn't a multi-unit modern build. It was a high-density senior living facility, designed with the cheapest materials legal loopholes could provide. But that wasn't the snap. The snap was the digital signature on every single page of the structural plans. My signature, my professional seal. I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. I had never seen these plans. I had never consulted on this project. But there it was, Walter Daniel Reed, licensed architect, born in Borntrum, Chinwe High. They had forged my seal on a project that, according to the load-bearing calculations I was looking at, was a structural disaster waiting to happen. The shear walls were insufficient for the Charleston wind zones. The foundation depth was a joke. If this building were ever constructed and it failed, which it would, the investigation would lead straight back to me. I wouldn't just lose my house. I would spend my final years in a federal prison for criminal negligence and fraud. Stephanie wasn't just trying to take my money. She was using my reputation as a human shield for a scam that could kill dozens of people. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk. This was the Mount Pleasant project Stephanie had mentioned in the laundry room. She and Henderson weren't just developers. They were predators who had found a way to bypass every safety regulation by using a distinguished icon as their unwitting fall guy. And Nathan, my son, the man I had taught about integrity, had clearly been the one to provide them with the digital copies of my seal from my old office files. I didn't have time to mourn that realization. I had to move. I called Marshall Cade. When he picked up, I didn't say hello. They forged my seal, Marshall. The Mount Pleasant project is a death trap, and my name is on every page of the structural schematics. The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds. Are you sure? I'm an architect, Marshall. I can read a blueprint better than I can read a room. If they build this, it will collapse during the first category high hurricane that hits the coast. They're using my license to authorize a crime. This changes the geometry of everything, Marshall said, his voice dropping into that low, tactical register. If you sign those papers at Home PM, you're not just giving them the house. You're effectively ratifying their use of your identity. You'd be walking into a trap with no exit. I know, that's why we aren't going to stop the meeting. Walter, I want them to bring the notary. I want them to bring the documents. I want Henderson to stand in my house and believe he's won. Because I'm not just going to defend myself, Marshall. I'm going to bury them under the weight of their own scaffolding. At Home PM, I came out of my study. I had dressed carefully, a charcoal wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and the gold watch Claire had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look exactly like the opinionated museum they expected. I wanted them to see a man who had finally realized he was beaten. Stephanie was in the living room, arranging white lilies in a crystal vase. She looked up as I descended the stairs, her eyes scanning me for any sign of the confusion she'd been documenting. You look nice, Walter, she said, her voice smooth and dangerous. Are you ready for this afternoon? It's for the best, you know. Once the papers are signed, we can move forward as a family. No more tension, no more recordings. I walked to the window and looked out at the marsh. The tide was coming in, the water creeping through the tall grass like a secret. You know, Stephanie, I've been thinking about what you said, about my legacy, about Cody's future. And I realized that I've been very selfish. I said, pitching my voice to be slightly more frail, slightly more hollow than usual. I've been clinging to a pile of bricks and wood while my son is struggling. I suppose an old man has to know when the structure is no longer viable. I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes. It was a bright, ugly thing. She didn't just want the money. She wanted the submission. She wanted to know she had broken me. I'm glad you've seen reason, she said, stepping closer. She smelled like expensive perfume and something metallic, the smell of the trap. Nathan will be so relieved. He's in his office, trying to keep things together. He's been very stressed, Walter. Your resistance hasn't been easy on him. I'll go speak with him, I said. I walked into Nathan's home office. He was sitting at his desk, staring at a blank computer screen. The room smelled of stale coffee and desperation. When he saw me, he flinched, a quick, involuntary movement of the shoulders that told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. Dad, he said, his voice cracked. Nathan, I replied. I sat in the chair across from him. I saw the plans for the Mount Pleasant project. He went completely still. His hands, which had been resting on the desk, curled into fists. What plans? The ones on the thumb drive Claire kept, the ones with my seal on them. The silence in the room became unbearable. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the same clock I'd given him when he passed the bar. I didn't have a choice, Nathan whispered, and for the first time, I saw the truth. He wasn't just a partner in this, he was a hostage. The Broad Street deal, it wasn't just a slow patch. I lost everything, Dad. I used client funds to cover the margin calls. Henderson found out. He told me he'd disbar me, put me in prison, unless I helped him with the senior living expansion. Stephanie, she said it was the only way to save our family. By forging my name on a death trap? I asked. My voice was no longer frail. It was the voice of the man who had built this house. By killing people in their sleep so you could stay in a gated community. I thought I could fix the calculations later. Nathan stood up, his face flushed. I thought once the permit was issued, I could hire a real engineer to quietly adjust the specs, but Henderson wouldn't let me. He said the profit margins were too thin. He said your name was the only thing that mattered. My name is all I have left, Nathan, and you gave it to a vulture. She's going to release that tape, Dad. She's going to tell the world you killed Mom. I leaned forward, my shadow falling across his desk. She can't release what she doesn't understand, Nathan. I have the unedited recording. I know what you and Stephanie were doing in that hospital room while your mother was dying. I know about the passwords. I know about the memorial fund. Nathan's face went from red to a ghostly, translucent white. He sank back into his chair as if his bones had turned to lead. You have the original? I have everything. I have the proof of the forgery, the proof of the embezzlement, and the proof of the extortion. Then why are you here? He asked, his voice trembling. Why haven't you called the police? Because you're still my son, I said, and the words felt like they were being pulled out of me with pliers. And because I want to see if there's a single load-bearing wall left in your character. At Hong PM, you have a choice. You can stand with them, or you can stand with me. But know this, Nathan, the house is already falling. The only question is who is inside when it hits the ground. I stood up and walked out before he could answer. The final hour was the longest. I spent it in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee. I watched Stephanie through the doorway. She was on the phone, her voice hushed but urgent. She was talking to the developer, telling them the old man was ready. She was already spending the money I hadn't given her yet, at Bourne. 9 PM, a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Henderson stepped out, followed by a woman carrying a briefcase, the notary. They entered the house with the confidence of conquerors. Henderson shook my hand, his grip firm and oily. Mr. Reed, good to see you. I'm glad we could resolve this like gentlemen. It's a win-win for everyone. Is it? I asked, my voice mild. Of course, Henderson said, opening his briefcase and spreading a thick stack of documents on the dining room table, the same table where we'd sat for Thanksgiving. We have the voluntary transfer of guardianship, the demolition permit application, and the settlement agreement regarding the medical allegations. Once these are signed and notarized, the digital files in Stephanie's possession will be permanently deleted. You have my word as an officer of the court. I looked at the documents. The ink seemed to shimmer under the chandelier. Where's Nathan? Henderson asked, glancing toward the hallway. He's coming, I said. Nathan stepped into the room. He looked like a ghost. He didn't look at Stephanie and he didn't look at me. He walked to the table and stood next to Henderson. Let's get started, Stephanie said, her hand resting on the back of my chair. Walter, you first. I picked up the pen. It was a heavy silver fountain pen, the one Claire had bought me when I opened my firm. I felt the weight of it in my hand. I looked at the demolition permit. I looked at the line where my signature was supposed to go, the signature they had already forged a dozen times on the Mount Pleasant plans. I have a question, Mr. Henderson, I said, looking up. About the Mount Pleasant project. Henderson's eyes sharpened. A tiny ripple of alarm crossed his face, but he smoothed it over instantly. This isn't about that, Walter. Let's stay focused on the matter at hand. But it is about that, I said, because I was looking at the structural schematics this morning, the ones with my seal on them, and I noticed that the shear wall calculations are off by nearly 40%. If a storm hits, that building will fold like a cardboard box. I was wondering, as a partner in that development, were you planning to fix that before or after the residents moved in? The room went into a deep, freezing silence. The notary looked up, her expression shifting from boredom to sudden, sharp alertness. Stephanie's hand tightened on my chair until her knuckles were white. Walter, you're confused. You haven't seen any plans. You're having one of your episodes. I'm not having an episode, Stephanie, I said. I pulled the silver thumb drive from my pocket and set it on the table. I'm having a realization. And I think the notary should know that the documents she's about to witness are being signed under the threat of extortion. That's enough, Henderson snapped, reaching for the thumb drive. But Nathan moved faster. He stepped between Henderson and the table. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at the man who had been holding the leash. It's over, Bill, Nathan said. His voice was shaky, but it was there. The calculations are wrong. The whole thing is a fraud, and I'm not signing anything. Nathan, Stephanie shrieked. What are you doing? Think about Cody. Think about our life. I am thinking about Cody. Nathan yelled back, turning to face her. I don't want him to grow up with a father who's a murderer because he was too afraid to admit he failed. Henderson's face twisted into something truly ugly. The mask was gone. "You're both pathetic. Nathan, if you don't make him sign, I'll have the police here in 10 minutes with the recording of your father's mercy kill. You'll both lose everything." "Actually," I said, leaning back in my chair, "I've already called the police, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the Board of Architectural Review." I looked at the clock. Numb. High PM. They should be pulling into the driveway, right about now. 10. As if on cue, the sound of multiple engines filled the drive. Blue and red lights began to flash against the dining room walls, reflecting off the silver and the crystal. Stephanie looked at the window, then back at me. Her face was no longer curated. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You old bastard. You think this saves you? I'll tell everyone. I'll make sure your name is dragged through the mud until there's nothing left." "You can try, Stephanie," I said quietly. "But as I told you before, I know how to build things meant to last, and I know exactly how to dismantle a structure that is no longer sound." The front door kicked open, but as the officers flooded the room, I saw something I hadn't expected. I saw Stephanie reach into her bag not for a phone and not for the recording. She pulled out a small, heavy folder and threw it onto the table. "You think you have the only secrets in this house, Walter?" she spat, even as an officer grabbed her arm. "Look at the probate records from Claire's estate. Look at the transfer of interest, your wife, signed 3 weeks before she died." I felt a sudden, sharp coldness in my gut. I looked at the folder. "She didn't leave the house to you, Walter." Stephanie laughed as they led her away. "She left her half to me. We've just been waiting for the right moment to claim it." I looked at Nathan. He was staring at the folder, his face filled with a new kind of horror. "Dad," he whispered. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." I reached for the folder, my hands finally starting to shake. If Stephanie was telling the truth, if Claire had signed over her interest in the house to her, then the trust was invalid. The house wasn't mine to protect. I opened the folder, and my world shifted for the final time. The blue and red lights of the patrol cars outside strobed against the dining room walls, turning the white lilies into rhythmic, ghostly flickers of color. It was the kind of lighting that reveals every imperfection in a room, every layer of dust, every hairline crack in the plaster. 2 officers were escorting Henderson toward the door, his oily confidence finally replaced by a frantic, whispered conversation with the notary, who looked ready to bolt. Another officer had his hand on Stephanie's arm, leading her toward the hallway. But Stephanie wasn't looking at the officers. She was looking at me, her head tilted at a sharp, mocking angle, a terrifying smile stretching across her face. "Open it, Walter," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos of the police radios. "See what your perfect marriage was actually built on." I reached for the heavy manila folder she'd thrown onto the table. My fingers, usually so steady when holding a drafting pen or a chisel, felt like they belonged to someone else. Beside me, Nathan was a statue of grief. He didn't move to help me. He didn't even breathe. I opened the folder. Inside was a single document, a quitclaim deed for Mutngin Tarmtrum Born Muy Bar Palmetto Bluff Drive. It was dated July Muy Bornth, Hangin Lair Muy Born, exactly 3 weeks before Claire died. According to the text, Claire had transferred her 50% interest in the property not to me and not to a trust, but to Stephanie Collins. Wait. July Hangin Lair Muy Born. Nathan hadn't even met Stephanie in July Hangin Lair Muy Born. At least, that's what he'd told me. They supposedly met in early Hangin Lair Muy Sar at a real estate mixer. "I don't understand," I whispered, the words feeling like dry sand in my throat. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Claire's. There was no mistaking the elegant, looping C or the way she crossed her T's with a slight upward flick. But it was shaky, the signature of a woman whose body was failing her, whose hand was being guided by something other than strength. "She knew, Walter," Stephanie called out from the hallway, her voice echoing off the heart pine floors I'd polished so carefully. "She knew Nathan was in trouble even back then. She knew you were too focused on your legacy to see your own son drowning. She gave me that interest to ensure Nathan would always have a place to go when you finally turned your back on him. We've been planning this since the day she took her last breath." The officer pulled her toward the door, but her laughter lingered in the room like the smell of a stagnant marsh. "Marshall," I said, my voice cracking. "Look at this." Marshall Cade stepped forward, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He took the document, adjusted his glasses, and scanned it with the predatory speed of a man who has spent 40 years looking for loopholes. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound in the room was the steady rain finally beginning to lash against the windows and the distant click-clack of the officer's boots on the porch. "The date is the problem, Walter," Marshall said finally. "If this is real, and if it was recorded even late, it supersedes the trust. You can't put a property into a trust if you only own half of it. The QPRT would be legally defective, which means the demolition permit she was trying to force you to sign. She might not have even needed it if she could prove she was a co-owner. But she wasn't Stephanie Reed back then," I argued. "She was Stephanie Collins. Nathan didn't even know her." I turned to Nathan. He was leaning against the sideboard, his head in his hands. "Nathan," I said, walking toward him. "Look at me. Did you know her in Haingen-Lermoy-Born? Did you bring her into your mother's hospital room while I was at the office?" Nathan looked up, and I saw a level of shame that no parent should ever have to witness in their child. It was the look of a man who had sold his soul in increments, so slowly he hadn't noticed he was empty until the light hit him. "She was a consultant for the firm." "Dad," Nathan whispered. "I was already in over my head with the Broad Street project. I'd misappropriated funds, just like I told you, Stephanie. She was the one Henderson sent to clean up the books. She told me she could help. She said Mom wanted to help too. She spent hours with her while you were working late on the MUSC project. She told Mom that you were going to lose everything because of my mistakes, and that the only way to save the house was to put her half in Stephanie's name for safekeeping." "Safekeeping?" I roared, the sound echoing through the empty house. "She was a stranger. Your mother was on morphine, Nathan. She was dying." "I know," Nathan screamed back, his voice breaking into a sob. "I know, okay? I've lived with it every day for 6 years. Stephanie said if I ever told you, she'd go to the police about the embezzlement. She's had me in a cage since before the funeral. The marriage, the blog, the move into this house, it was all her consolidating her investment. I'm not a son to her, Dad. I'm a line item." I felt a wave of cold fury wash over me. In architecture, there is a term called progressive collapse. It's what happens when one structural element fails, and the load it was carrying is transferred to the next, which then fails, and so on, until the entire building is a heap of rubble. My marriage, my son, my career, it was all falling. "Marshall, take him," I said, pointing at Nathan. "Take him to your office. Get a full statement. Record everything. If that deed was signed under duress or through fraudulent misrepresentation of a dying woman's state of mind, I want it buried." "It's not that simple, Walter," Marshall warned. "The notary on this deed, look at the name." I looked. Sarah Jenkins. My heart skipped a beat. Sarah Jenkins had been my head drafter for 15 years. She was the one woman Claire had trusted with everything. She had retired shortly after Claire's death and moved to Florida. If Sarah had notarized this, it meant she had been in that hospital room. It meant the museum had been betrayed from within the walls. By Saturday morning, the story had shifted. The news of the arrests at Palmetto Bluff Drive hadn't hit the papers yet, but Stephanie's curated world was already fighting back. I sat in my study, the recording of the hospital room playing on a loop in my head. I didn't need the digital file anymore, the memory was enough. But then, I opened my laptop. Stephanie's blog, the one with Bornmoy Bar, followers, had a new post. It must have been scheduled in advance. A dead man's switch for her digital empire. The headline was, "Trapped in the Museum. Why I'm finally breaking my silence on the Reed family." It was a masterpiece of manipulation. She had posted photos of me looking confused at the grocery store, photos she'd clearly taken when I was just lost in thought about a project. She had snippets of the edited recording, the ones that made me sound cold and calculating about Claire's death. But the worst part was the comment section. Thousands of people were calling for my head. "Disgusting old man. He killed his wife for the insurance money. Poor Stephanie, trying to save that beautiful house from a monster." The public narrative was being built faster than I could dismantle it. I was being humiliated in the very city I had helped build. I received a call from the board of the MUSC pediatric wing. They were postponing the dedication of the new fountain I'd designed. They cited unforeseen PR sensitivities. I was being erased. I spent the afternoon in Claire's garden, the one place Stephanie hadn't managed to curate because she hated the dirt. I was digging near the azaleas, my hands caked in the black low-country soil, trying to find some sense of grounding. That's when I found the box. It was buried 6 inches down, wrapped in a heavy-duty plastic builder's bag. It was a small, tin lunchbox, the one Nathan had used in kindergarten. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Claire, dated 2 days before the deed was signed. "Walter," it began. "If you're reading this, it means Stephanie wasn't who she said she was. I'm not as drugged as they think I am. I can see the way she looks at our son, like he's a project to be finished. I'm going to sign the paper she wants. I have to. She told me she'd put Nathan in prison today if I didn't. But Walter, look at the second witness. I've left you a trail. Don't trust the notary. Trust the surveyor." I stared at the letter. The second witness on the deed was a name I'd glossed over: Benjamin Cole. Benny Cole wasn't a notary. He was the land surveyor I'd used for 30 years. He was the only man who knew the true boundaries of every property I'd ever touched. I looked back at the deed. Benny's signature was there, but beside it, he had written a small, almost invisible string of numbers. To anyone else, it looked like a filing code. But I was an architect. I knew those numbers. They were GPS coordinates, and they weren't for the house at Palmetto Bluff Drive. I stood up, the letter clutched in my hand. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, hitting the marsh with a blinding golden light. Stephanie thought she had stolen the house. She thought she had the deed to my life. But she had underestimated the two people who knew the foundations of this family best. Me and the woman who had helped me pour them. I called Diana Foster. "Diana, I need you to find Benny Cole, and I need a boat. We aren't going to the house." "Where are we going, Walter?" "To the only place the deed actually covers," I said, a cold smile finally reaching my eyes. "To the ground." She forgot to check. As I walked toward the Claire, I realized the final twist was yet to come. Because if the deed didn't cover the house, it meant Stephanie had spent 6 years and millions of dollars protecting a piece of property that didn't exist. And I was about to show her exactly what happens when you build your entire life on a map that's been drawn in disappearing ink. By Saturday morning, the city of Charleston, the place I had helped shape, the city I had loved with the devotion of a man who knows every brick of its history, had turned into a hall of mirrors. The opinionated museum was now the monster of Palmetto Bluff. Stephanie's blog post had gone viral with the speed of a structural fire. Every time I looked at my phone, the numbers climbed. Moat Trum, Hong Views, High Trum, Hong, 500,000. The public didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain. They wanted to believe that the prestigious architect with the white hair and the bow ties was actually a cold-blooded opportunist who had smothered his wife's final days to protect his bottom line. I received a frantic call from the historic Charleston Foundation. They were temporarily suspending my emeritus status. The local coffee shop where I'd had my morning espresso for 15 years suddenly had no available tables when I walked in. I was being demolished in real time. But as I sat on the deck of the Claire, the letter from Claire tucked into my vest pocket, I felt a strange, cold clarity. In architecture, there's a concept called sacrificial cladding. It's a layer of material designed to be destroyed by the elements so that the core structure remains untouched. Stephanie thought she was destroying the core. She didn't realize she was just peeling away the surface. "Walter, I found him," Diana Foster's voice crackled over the phone. "Benny Cole is living in a fishing shack out near McClellanville. He doesn't have a cell phone, but I tracked his truck. He's waiting for us. And Walter, he told me to tell you to bring the original survey of Chin Muy born. Teen H. I didn't know it yet, but that survey was the key to a trap Claire had set 10 years ago. The drive to McClellanville took an hour, winding through the live oaks draped in Spanish moss that looked like gray funeral shrouds in the damp morning air. Benny Cole was 82 years old, with skin like cured leather and eyes that had spent too many decades squinting through a transit lens. He was sitting on a porch that defied gravity, cleaning a mess of whiting with a knife that was older than Nathan. "Walter," he said, not looking up. "I wondered when you'd find the box. I told Claire you were too busy looking at the sky to see what was under your feet." "Benny," I said, sitting on the top step. "The deed, the coordinates. What did you do?" Benny set down the knife and wiped his hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric. He pulled a crumpled map from his pocket, the original Mtngin Chin Trum Chin Muy born survey of the Palmetto Bluff lot. "Claire called me 2 weeks before she passed. She was terrified, Walter, not of the cancer. She was terrified of that girl, Stephanie, and what she was doing to Nathan. She knew Nathan had stolen from the firm. She knew Henderson was squeezing him. But she also knew you'd never forgive the boy if you found out. She was trying to protect you both." I felt a sharp, familiar ache in my chest. Claire had always been the one to carry the invisible loads. She told me she had to sign that deed. Benny continued. Stephanie was threatening to call the police on Nathan that very afternoon. So Claire asked me to witness it, but she gave me a look, that look she used to give you when you were over-engineering a porch. She told me to make sure the legal description was accurate. In a deed, the address Mutngin Tom Trum Bornmui by Palmetto Bluff Drive is just a label. The legal description is the actual DNA of the property. It defines the boundaries in degrees, minutes, and seconds. I didn't use the description for the house, Walter, Benny said, a slow, toothless grin spreading across his face. In Chinmui Born, when you bought that land, there was a small 2-foot-wide spite strip that ran along the edge of the marsh, a remnant from an old Mui 10th century land grant. It's a piece of dirt that can't be built on, can't be taxed, and is technically underwater 6 hours a day. I swapped the pages. Stephanie didn't check the coordinates. She was too busy looking at Claire's signature. I stared at the map. The GPS coordinates Claire had left me didn't point to the house. They pointed to a patch of mud and cordgrass. So the deed she's been holding over my head. It's for a swamp, Walter. Benny laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. She spent 6 years thinking she owned half your estate. In reality, she owns 50% of a place for crabs to hide. She's been paying consulting fees and taxes and lawyer bills to protect a piece of land that doesn't exist on any modern tax map. I felt a laugh bubble up in my own throat, a wild, jagged thing. The structural irony was perfect. Stephanie, the master of curated living, had built her entire criminal empire on a foundation of salt and silt. But then, the laughter died. The blog, Benny. The recording. She's still destroying my name. The deed being fake doesn't stop the world from thinking I'm a murderer. That's why you need to look at the second set of coordinates, Benny said, pointing to the very bottom of the map, where he'd etched a second string of numbers into the margin. Claire didn't just sabotage the deed. She left a final inspection report. The second coordinates led back to the house, specifically to the library at the historic Charleston Foundation. I didn't go myself. I was too much of a pariah to walk through those doors. I sent Diana. 2 hours later, she met me at the marina. She was carrying a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the kind the city used to keep for minor works and alterations before everything went digital. Walter, she said, her face pale, you're not going to believe what's in the archives. Stephanie didn't just forge your seal for the Mount Pleasant project. She's been doing it for years. But she wasn't just doing it for her blog. She opened the ledger to a page dated 3 years ago. It was a permit application for a structural stabilization of a historic property on Church Street. The architect of record was Walter Daniel Reed. The contractor? Henderson Development Group. I never worked on Church Street, I said. I know, Diana said, but look at the after photos in the file. I looked. My heart stopped. The stabilization wasn't a repair. It was a deliberate weakening of the internal timber frames. They had used corrosive salts in the mortar and removed the iron tie rods that held the high, trum-year-old walls together. They've been doing this all over the city, Diana whispered. They target historic buildings, use your name to get the permits for repairs that actually accelerate the rot, and then wait for the bar to declare the buildings unsafe for occupancy. Once the buildings are condemned, Henderson buys them for pennies on the dollar, tears them down, and builds his luxury condos. It was a systematic architectural assassination of Charleston, and I was the one holding the smoking gun, even though my hand had never touched the trigger. I realized then that this was never just about my house or my money. I was the load-bearing element of a massive citywide fraud. As long as my reputation was intact, my seal was the golden ticket. But now that Stephanie was being arrested for the Mount Pleasant project, she was using the murder recording to destroy me so that the investigation would stop at my desk. If I was a monster and a fraud, then all those condemned buildings on Church Street were my fault, not Henderson's. They were going to let me take the fall for the destruction of the city's history. We have to go to the press, I said. No, Diana said. If you go to the press now, it just looks like you're trying to deflect. We need to do something bigger. We need to show the city the snap before the building falls. Monday morning. The Board of Architectural Review was holding an emergency meeting to discuss the Walter Reed scandal. The room was packed with reporters, socialites, and the old money families who had once called me a friend. I could see the disgust on their faces. I was the man who had betrayed the holy city. Stephanie was there too. She had been released on a massive bail, likely paid by Henderson's offshore accounts. She sat in the front row, wearing a modest black dress and a look of tragic stoicism. She was playing the wrong daughter-in-law to perfection. Nathan sat 3 rows back, looking like a man waiting for the hangman. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. Mr. Reed, in light of the evidence presented on the Curated Life blog and the disturbing audio recordings that have come to light, this board is prepared to recommend the permanent revocation of your license. And, I'd like to present a final project, I said, standing up. The room went silent. A few people snickered. Stephanie leaned back, a smug, curated smile on her lips. This isn't the time for a portfolio review, Walter, the chairman snapped. It's not my portfolio, I said. I walked to the front of the room and plugged a small device into the projector. It's a structural analysis of a fraud. I didn't play the recording of Claire's death first. I played the video Diana had captured using a drone over the Mount Pleasant project site just 2 hours ago. It showed the foundation pits, the ones based on my forged plans. As an architect, I told the silent room, I know that a building tells the truth even when the people inside it don't. These foundations are designed to fail, and they aren't the only ones. I flashed the Church Street photos on the screen. I showed the forged seals. I showed the spite strip deed that Stephanie had been using as her primary leverage. And as for the recording, I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant thrum, the one where I allegedly killed my wife for her money? Let's hear the unedited version, the one Stephanie forgot to delete from the original source. I hit play. The room listened as my voice begged the doctor to use the memorial fund to save Claire. They listened as I cried, promising to spend every cent to buy her 1 more hour of life. And then they heard the part Stephanie had cut out, the part where she entered the room, the part where she talked about the passwords, the part where she told Nathan that Claire was already dead weight. The silence that followed was so profound you could hear the air conditioning hum. I looked at Stephanie. The smile was gone. Her face had turned a sickly, translucent gray. She looked like a building that had just lost its primary support beam. She stood up, reaching for her bag, but Diana Foster was already standing at the exit with 2 detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. But wait, I said, the mini hook I'd been saving for the very end. There's one more thing. Stephanie, you always told me I was worthless. You told Nathan to cut me off, but you forgot the most basic rule of surveying. I pointed to the screen, showing the legal description of the spite strip. You've been paying the property taxes on that strip of mud for 6 years, I said. And in South Carolina, paying taxes on a property you don't actually own but claim to. Well, that's called voluntary assumption of liability. By trying to steal my house, you inadvertently signed yourself as the primary guarantor for every forged project Henderson ever built using that LLC. You don't just own a TWAM, Stephanie. You own the debt for every failing building in this city. The snap was audible this time. Stephanie let out a strangled, animalistic sound and collapsed into her seat. But as the police moved in, I looked at Nathan. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. It wasn't relief. It was a final, devastating secret. Dad, he mouthed. I realized then that the Mount Pleasant project wasn't the biggest fraud Henderson and Stephanie had committed. There was one more building, one more structure that was about to fall, and this one was going to take the entire Reed name with it. Nathan, what did you do? I whispered. The trust, Dad, he said, his voice carrying to the front of the room. The trust you set up for Cody? Henderson didn't just want the house. He wanted the capital. He had me sign the substitution of assets form last night. I felt the floor drop away, the $1 million, the money for my grandson's future. It's gone, isn't it? I asked. It's not gone, Nathan said, tears streaming down his face. It's in the Church Street development. He used Cody's inheritance to fund the very buildings you just proved are death traps. I looked at the room. The victory felt like ashes. I had won the battle for my name, but I had just condemned my grandson to poverty or worse. The building wasn't just falling. It was a total, catastrophic collapse. And I was the one who had pulled the trigger. The silence that followed the BAR meeting wasn't the peaceful quiet of a job well done. It was the ringing in your ears after a structural collapse, the kind where the dust is so thick you can't tell if you're still standing or if you've been buried alive. I sat in my study that evening, the lights of Mutngin Tarm Trum Bournemouth Bar Palmetto Bluff Drive dimmed. For the first time in 30 years, the house felt like a stranger to me. I looked at the walls I'd framed and the floors I'd laid. and all I could see were the ghosts of the decisions I'd made. I had saved my reputation. I had exposed the fraud. But in the process, I had watched my grandson's $1 million future vanish into a hole in the ground on Church Street. Nathan was gone, taken in for questioning as a co-conspirator. Henderson and Stephanie were in separate cells at the sheriff's department, but even from behind bars, they were winning. By moving Cody's trust into the Church Street partnership, they had tied my grandson's inheritance to a liability. The moment those buildings were declared structurally unsound, the partnership would go bankrupt. The creditors would swarm, and Cody's money would be liquidated to pay for the unforeseen demolition costs of Henderson's death traps. It was a perfectly engineered suicide pact. If I destroyed them, I destroyed Cody. I've always said that a building tells the truth, but I'd forgotten that sometimes the truth is meant to be a trap. I stayed up until Hong AM, staring at the substitution of assets form Nathan had signed. My son's shaky handwriting was the final crack in the foundation. He had been so scared of losing his life that he had signed away his sons. I didn't know it yet, but the very worthlessness Stephanie had accused me of was about to become my greatest weapon. Monday morning, the city of Charleston was waking up to a different world. The Reed scandal was the only thing on the local news, but the narrative had shifted. I wasn't the villain anymore. I was the tragic hero who had uncovered a conspiracy. But heroes don't pay the bills, and they certainly don't recover stolen trust funds from a bankrupt LLC. I called Marshall Cade at Hong AM. "Marshall," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "I need you to look at the substitution of assets one more time. Not the signature. Look at the timing." "Walter, it's airtight," Marshall sighed. He signed it the night before the hearing. The assets were moved electronically within minutes. It was the typeless too. The $1 million is currently sitting in the Church Street Partnership's capital account. It's already been earmarked for the first phase of the stabilization repairs. "Repairs that I just proved are fraudulent," I said. "Repairs that the city is going to halt today." "Exactly," Marshall said, "which means the account will be frozen by the court. And when the lawsuits from the other investors hit people who bought into Henderson's condos, they'll go after that capital account first. Cody's money is at the bottom of a very long list of creditors." I felt the weight of it. In architecture, this is the point where you decide whether to abandon the site or try to shore it up. But you can't shore up a building that's already been demolished. What if the buildings don't exist? I asked. "What do you mean?" "The Church Street properties. They're historic. They're supposed to be stabilized. But if I can prove they were never actually stabilized, that the permits were based on a forgery of my seal, then the entire partnership is based on a non-existent legal entity. The contract for the substitution of assets would be void ab initio, from the beginning. It's a long shot, Walter. You'd need the original survey data and a physical inspection that proves the fraud started before the money was moved." "I have the survey data," I said, thinking of Benny Cole, "and I'm going to do the inspection myself." I drove to Church Street at dawn. The morning fog was so thick I could barely see the steeples of St. Michael's. The properties Henderson had targeted were beautiful, decaying grand dames of the Mui 10th century 3-story brick houses with sagging piazzas and iron gates that groaned in the wind. I put on my high-visibility vest and grabbed my architectural kit. I didn't care about the yellow tape. I didn't care about the no trespassing signs. This was my city, and these were my forged signatures. I spent 4 hours crawling through crawl spaces and climbing into attics. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Henderson hadn't just been negligent, he'd been surgical. He'd used a chemical wash on the support beams that looked like fireproofing but actually accelerated the dry rot. He'd replaced the structural bolts with cheap zinc replicas that would shear off under the slightest tension. But then, I saw it. In the basement of the largest house, the one slated to be the anchor of the luxury development, there was a new concrete pour. It looked like a standard footer, but the dimensions were wrong. It was too thick, too deliberate. I took out my masonry hammer and chipped away a corner of the fresh concrete. Underneath the gray stone, I saw a flash of blue, plastic. I dug further, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't a structural footer, it was a cache. Hidden inside the concrete was a series of waterproof Pelican cases. I pried one open with a crowbar. Inside were stacks of ledgers, thumb drives, and something that made the air leave my lungs. The original, unedited digital files of every single forged project Henderson had ever executed. But it wasn't just the forgeries. It was the parallel ledger. Stephanie hadn't just been helping Henderson steal from me. She had been skimming from him. For every dollar Henderson had stolen from my accounts or the Church Street investors, Stephanie had diverted 30 cents into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account Henderson didn't know about. The substitution of assets form Nathan had signed hadn't just moved $1 million into the partnership. It had moved it into a clearing account that Stephanie had sole access to. She hadn't been trying to save the project. She had been preparing to vanish the moment the hearing was over. I wasn't just looking at a fraud, I was looking at a double cross. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the basement, the Pelican case open in front of me. I realized then that I'd been playing the wrong game. I'd been playing the game of an architect, trying to fix the structure. I needed to start playing the game of a demolition expert. I called Diana Foster. Diana, I need you to get a warrant for the Church Street site, not for the fraud. For a safety emergency, I've found something that's going to make the Mount Pleasant project look like a parking ticket. What did you find, Walter? The reason Stephanie was so confident, I said. She didn't just have a recording of me. She had the entire city's financial history in a concrete box. And she was using my grandson's trust fund as her exit strategy. I didn't tell her that I had already taken one of the thumb drives. I didn't tell her that I'd seen a name in the Cayman ledgers that changed everything. The name wasn't Reed. It wasn't Henderson. It was Patterson, the manager of the bank on Calhoun Street. The snap was deepening this time. The transfer of $1 million on that Friday morning, the one I thought I'd executed so cleanly, hadn't been a victory. Patterson had been in on it from the start. He'd flagged my account the moment I walked in, alerting Stephanie and Henderson. The reason the Matrumwe high calls had started was because they were watching the money move in real time. I realized then that the safe trust I'd created was just another room in their house. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of tactical calculation. I didn't go home. I stayed on the Claire, the only place I knew for sure wasn't bugged or monitored. I worked on the boat's engine, the repetitive motion of the wrench keeping my mind focused. I needed to move the pieces in a way they couldn't anticipate. They expected me to go to the police. They expected me to file a lawsuit. Instead, I went to see Patterson. I walked into the bank on Calhoun Street at Mui Hong AM on Wednesday. I wasn't wearing my suit. I was wearing my work clothes, sawdust on my trousers, grease on my hands. I looked like an old man who had finally given up. Patterson saw me and his smile was a masterpiece of false empathy. Mr. Reed, we've been hearing the news. A terrible business. Truly. I'm tired, Patterson, I said, leaning heavily on his desk. I want to close the W.D. Reed Family Trust. I want to move whatever's left into a personal account for Nathan. He's going to need it for the legal fees. Patterson's eyes gleamed. He thought I was surrendering. He thought the opinionated museum was finally selling off its last assets. Of course, Walter, it's a very wise decision. Let me get the paperwork. As he turned to the computer, I slipped the thumb drive I'd found in the basement into the back of his terminal. It was a keylogger, a device Diana had given me that would record every keystroke he made for the next hour. There seems to be a hold on the account, Patterson said, frowning at the screen. Because of the ongoing investigation into the Church Street partnership. I figured, I said, my voice shaking slightly, a performance I was getting far too good at. Is there anything you can do? As a friend? Patterson leaned in, his voice a low, greasy whisper. There might be a way to bypass the freeze if we reroute the funds through a temporary holding entity. It's a bit unorthodox, but given the circumstances. Do it, I said. I just want it over with. I watched him type. I watched him enter the codes. I watched him authorize a rerouting that he thought was moving the remnants of the trust into a place where he and Stephanie could split it. He didn't realize that the keylogger wasn't just recording his passwords. It was transmitting his IP address and his unorthodox authorization directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who were currently sitting in a van 3 blocks away, listening to every word via the microphone I'd hidden in my vest. I stood up and shook his hand. Thank you, Patterson. You've been very helpful. Anytime, Walter. We take care of our own in Charleston. I walked out of the bank and into the bright, low-country sun. I didn't go to my car. I walked toward the harbor. My phone vibrated. A text from Diana. We got him. Patterson just authorized the transfer to the Cayman account. The FBI has the trail. They're moving on Stephanie and Henderson's offshore assets now. Walter, the $1 million isn't just coming back. With the civil penalties and the seizure of Henderson's legitimate holdings, Cody's trust is going to triple. I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite joy. It was the feeling of a building that had been swaying in the wind, finally finding its center. But I wasn't finished. I had one more call to make, one more structure to dismantle. I called the sheriff's department and asked to speak with Nathan. Because as much as I'd saved the money and as much as I'd cleared my name, there was still the matter of the spite strip. There was still the matter of the fact that Nathan had known about Stephanie's past since Hang in Lair Muy born. Dad? Nathan's voice was hollow. I saved the money, Nathan, I said. Cody is going to be fine, better than fine. Thank God, Nathan sobbed. Dad, I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever you want. I'll testify. I know you will, I said. But you're not coming home, Nathan. The silence on the other end was the loudest one yet. What? I'm an architect, Nathan, I said, looking out at the Claire bobbing in slip 7. And I've realized that you can't live in a house that's been built on a lie, even if you're the one who told it. You're going to serve your time for the embezzlement. You're going to lose your license. And when you get out, you're going to find your own ground to stand on. Dad, please. I've already signed the papers. I said, I'm taking full custody of Cody. He's going to grow up on the Claire. He's going to learn about load-bearing walls and integrity. And he's going to learn that a name is something you earn, not something you inherit. I hung up. I walked down the dock to the Claire. The boat smelled of linseed oil and salt. It was a wreck when I found it, but today she looked beautiful. I looked back at the city of Charleston, the steeples, the history, the secrets. I realized that for 36 years I'd been building things for other people. I'd been trying to preserve a past that was already rotting. I stepped onto the boat and untied the lines. But as I looked at the horizon, I saw a familiar black sedan pulling into the marina parking lot. A car I knew wasn't the police and wasn't Marshall Cade. It was Henderson's developer partner, the one whose name hadn't been on any of the indictments, the quiet partner who really ran the Church Street project, and he wasn't there to talk about the trust fund. He was holding a very specific, very legal-looking document. And as he stepped out of the car, I realized that the final twist wasn't in the money, or the house, or the recordings. It was in the Claire. Mr. Reed, he called out, his voice echoing over the water. Before you sail away, I think you should check the hull identification number on that boat. Because according to the bill of sale from Mutngin Chin Trum Numui Hai, this catch doesn't belong to you. I felt the last support beam in my world give way. Who does it belong to? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It belongs to the estate of Claire Allen, he said, holding up the paper, and as her sole surviving executor. I'm here to take it back. The final reversal had arrived, and this time, there was no foundation left to stand on. The man standing on the dock wasn't like Henderson or Patterson. He didn't have the desperate hunger of a middle manager or the manic vanity of a social media influencer. Arthur Vance was a man of cold, hard edges, the kind of person who buys the land under your feet while you're still arguing about the color of the curtains. He was the quiet partner, the shadow financier, who had bankrolled Henderson's predatory developments for decades. He stood there holding a thick, blue-backed legal folder, looking at the Claire with the eyes of a man inspecting a foreclosed warehouse. Hull number Mutngin Chin Trum Numui Hai AR born, Vance said, his voice carrying clearly over the slap of the water against the pilings. Registered in Hang in Lair Muy Mot to Claire Allen Reed. According to the secondary probate filings, the ones your son Nathan so helpfully overlooked during the initial estate settlement, this vessel was never transferred to you, Walter. It remained a separate asset, specifically bequeathed to a holding company controlled by the executor, and that, as of 6 months ago, is me. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the wind. I looked down at the deck of the Claire. I had spent 4 years pouring my soul into these planks. I had sanded every inch of her, and now, at the moment of my escape, the ground, or rather the water, was being pulled out from under me. You're going to take a wooden boat? I asked, my voice sounding distant. After everything I've exposed? The FBI is already processing the Church Street files, Vance. Your name is all over those Cayman ledgers. Vance smiled, and it was the most chilling thing I'd seen in this entire ordeal. It wasn't a smile of malice, it was a smile of superior math. My name is on the ledgers as a creditor, Walter. I'm a victim of Stephanie's skimming, just like you. I've already turned over my personal records to the authorities. I'll be fine. But the Claire? She's a masterpiece now. And frankly, I have a buyer in Dubai who appreciates Mutngin Chin Trum Num Mui's American craftsmanship. She's worth more than the spite strip and the trust combined. He stepped toward the gangway. Step off the boat, Walter, or I call the harbor police and add theft of a motor vessel to your family's growing list of indictments. I looked at him, and then I looked at the Claire. And in that moment, I remembered something. I remembered the day I'd found her. She was a wreck, rotting in a tidal creek in Beaufort. I'd bought her for $500 from a man who said she'd belonged to a lady who knew her way around a survey. Don't trust the notary, trust the surveyor. Claire's words from the buried lunchbox echoed in my head. I realized then that the second set of coordinates Benny Cole had given me hadn't just led to the historic Charleston foundation. They had led to a specific structural detail on this boat. You're right, Vance, I said, stepping back from the railing. She is a masterpiece. But you haven't checked the keel, have you? Vance paused, his foot on the edge of the dock. The keel. What are you talking about? In Mutngin Chintrum Numwe High, these ketches were built with lead ballast keels, I said, my voice regaining its architectural weight. But this one, she was modified. Claire had her hauled out in Hangin Lermwe High right before the cancer got bad. She told me she was having the ribs reinforced, but I was an architect. I should have looked closer at the displacement. I walked to the center of the deck and grabbed a heavy brass winch handle. I didn't look at Vance. I looked at the floorboards near the mast, the ones I'd replaced just last month. I always wondered why she was so insistent on this specific boat, I whispered. I jammed the winch handle into a small, recessed slot in the mahogany trim that I'd previously thought was just a drainage port. I turned it 3 times to the left, a sequence I'd found etched into the back of the Chinmoy-born survey map Benny had given me. There was a muffled thunk deep in the belly of the boat. A small section of the floorboards, the load-bearing section beneath the navigation table, slid back 3 inches. Vance stepped onto the boat now, curiosity overcoming his caution. What is that? I pulled the panel up. Inside wasn't a cache of money or jewelry. It was a secondary hull plate made of heavy, fire-rated steel. And bolted to that plate was a series of original wet ink documents from Mutngin Chintrum Termoy Term, the year Vance first started his development group. Claire was a researcher for the city archives before she met me. Vance, I said, my heart hammering. She didn't just know where the land was. She knew where the bodies were buried. I pulled out the first document. It was a partnership agreement between Arthur Vance and a man named Caldwell, the father of the man who now ran the law firm representing Nathan and Stephanie. But it wasn't a real estate deal. It was a waste management contract. In the late 80s, you didn't build condos, Vance, I said, scanning the pages. You reclaimed marshland by filling it with industrial runoff from the old chemical plants. And then you built the foundations of the holy city right on top of it, including the land under MUSC, including the land under Palmetto Bluff. The color drained from Vance's face. This wasn't a skimming scandal. This was a catastrophic environmental crime that spanned 40 years. If these documents went public, every building Vance had ever touched would be condemned. He wouldn't just be bankrupt, he would be the most hated man in South Carolina history. Give those to me, Vance hissed, reaching into his coat for something that definitely wasn't a legal folder. I don't think so, I said, stepping back toward the throttle. You think you can sail away with those? Vance laughed, his hand lingering inside his jacket. I have the deed to this boat, Walter. You're trapped. No, Arthur, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. I'm an architect, and I just realized that this boat isn't a sanctuary. It's a sacrificial cladding. I hit the ignition. The Claire's engine roared to life, a deep, guttural thrum that shook the dock. The deed you have is for hull number Mutngin Chintrum Numwe High, AR born, I shouted over the engine. But if you check the HIN on the transom, you'll see I changed it last week during the restoration. This boat is technically registered as the W.D. Reed Research Vessel Mode. Your paperwork is for a ghost. I slammed the boat into reverse. Vance lunged for the railing, but he was too late. The Claire surged back, the lines snapping like whip cracks as they pulled the cleats right out of the weathered dock. Vance stumbled, his legal folder flying into the water, the blue-backed pages scattering like fallen leaves in the harbor. I didn't look back. I steered the Claire out into the center of the Cooper River, the low-country sun finally burning through the last of the fog. The resolution didn't happen overnight. It was like a slow, deliberate demolition. Arthur Vance was arrested 3 hours later at the Charleston International Airport. The documents I'd found in the Claire's keel provided the structural evidence the EPA and the FBI had been missing for decades. The entire Henderson group collapsed within a week, dragging the Caldwell and Price law firm down with it. Stephanie and Henderson are currently serving 15-year sentences for a litany of federal crimes. Stephanie tried to sell her prison diary to a publisher, but because of the Son of Sam laws, Every cent of the profit was diverted into a restitution fund for the Church Street victims. Her Bournemouth Bar Home followers vanished, replaced by a single permanent account terminated notice. Nathan served 2 years for his role in the embezzlement. He lost his license to practice law, which, strangely enough, seemed to be the thing that saved him. When he got out, he didn't come back to Charleston. He moved to the upstate and started working for a timber reclamation company, the kind of job where you have to get your hands dirty to see the value in the wood. We talk once a month. It's not a bridge yet, but the foundation is being poured. As for me, I kept my word. I took custody of Cody. We don't live at Mutngin Term Trum Bournemouth Bar Palmetto Bluff Drive. The house is currently being managed by the W.D. Reed Family Trust as a historical education center. The museum is finally being used to teach people how things are actually built. Cody and I live on the Clare. We spent the last year sailing the Intracoastal Waterway, from Charleston down to the Keys and back again. He's 6 now, and he can tie a bowline not faster than I can. He doesn't smell like baby shampoo and crackers anymore. He smells like salt, sun, and sawdust. Every morning we sit on the deck with our coffee juice for him and watch the sun come up over the Atlantic. Grandpa, Cody asked me this morning, pointing to a new bridge they're building over the Wando River. Why do they put the big pillars in the water first? I looked at the massive concrete structures rising out of the tide, solid and unmoving against the current. Because, Cody, I said, ruffling his hair, if the part people can't see isn't strong, then the part they can see is just a lie. And in this family, we don't build on lies anymore. I looked back at the city of Charleston, shimmering in the distance. The steeples were still there, the history was still there, but the rot had been scraped away. I'm Walter Daniel Reed. I'm 70 years old. I lost a house, a son's career, and a fortune. But as I watched my grandson sketch a blueprint of a seagull on a scrap of cedar, I realized I'd finally built the one thing that was actually meant to last. I had built a man of integrity, and for an architect, that's the only legacy that doesn't crumble.